My name is Floyd Denton. I'm 57 years old, and I have been writing checks for a family that stopped making room for me 2 years before I understood what was happening. The night I figured it out, I was in my recliner watching the Reds lose by 4 runs when my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. A photo post from Glenda, my son-in-law's mother. I tapped it without thinking. 47 photos. My granddaughter Willa's kindergarten spring recital at the elementary school on Birch Crossing Road, 14 miles from where I was sitting. Willa in a yellow paper sunflower costume with her hair and 2 braids. My grandson Declan cheering from the second row. My daughter Lacey crying into a tissue, the good kind, and in the front row with the best angle in the auditorium, and a handmade banner that said, "Willa, we love you," was Alvin, both father, sitting next to Glenda in chairs they clearly carried in from home. I scrolled all 47 photos. Nobody had forgotten to tell me the date. I want you to understand that, because it took me a week to get there myself. The recital had been listed in the school newsletter I never received, because I'm not on the school contact list. The school contact list has Bo's parents on it. It does not have me. I put my phone face down on the armrest, looked at the TV for a while. The Reds gave up another run. I turned it off. Then I opened my banking app. Before I tell you what I found, let me take you back to the Sunday afternoon in March, when I still believed everything was basically fine. I had stopped by Lacey and Bo's house to drop off a birthday present for Declan. He was turning 9, and I got as far as the front porch. That was how it had been for about a year and a half, without me ever naming it. I'd pull up, text that I was there, wait, we'd talk for 8 or 10 minutes in the doorway. Declan and Willow would wave from inside. Then Lacey would say she had to get back to it. That Sunday I noticed for the first time that the framed photo of me and Connie at Lacey's wedding was gone from the front hallway. I could see the nail hole from where I stood. In its place was a canvas print of the 4 of them at the Outer Banks. Nice photo, professional. I told myself they'd redecorated. My wife Connie died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 13 months from diagnosis. She handled everything when she was alive. The birthday cards, the holiday dinners, the Thursday phone calls for no particular reason. She kept a running list on her phone of what the grandkids needed, what sizes they wore, which one was afraid of dogs. When she died, I kept paying attention to those things. I just stopped announcing it. That's how I am. Give me a task, and I'll do it quietly for the next 30 years without mentioning it once. I have an HVAC business, Comfort Systems of Hendricks County. I started it at 29 with a used van and a credit card, and built it into something with 6 employees and a reputation. I should have retired at 55. I pushed it back twice. Once when I covered the down payment on Lacey and Bo's house, and once when I took on the school tuition payments and the math stopped working for my own accounts. I never told anyone either time. It didn't seem like something to mention. After Connie died, Lacey cried in my kitchen and said she didn't know how they were going to keep the catering kitchen going. She and Bo ran a small catering operation out of a rented commercial kitchen on the south side of Indianapolis. Weddings, corporate events. The rent was $1,050 a month, and they were 3 months behind. I told her I'd take care of it. I set up the transfer that weekend. A year later, the rent went to $1,150. I adjusted it. I never mentioned it again. Not at a holiday. Not when Bo made a joke about food service margins. Not when they posted photos from Hilton Head for an entire week. The night of the recital photos, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the app for the first time in months. $1,150 a month to the commercial kitchen on Southgate Drive, running 41 months. $490 a month toward Bo's truck loan. His credit had been a problem in 2021. I'd put the loan under my name as a favor and never revisited it. 19 months left. $875 a month to Hamilton Heights Academy. Declan and Will is private school. A scholarship covered the bulk of it. I covered the gap, 2.5 years running. I did the math on the back of a receipt from my wallet because I needed something to do with my hands. 250 now every month, plus the down payment on their house in 2020, $24,000, plus the dental work for Declan in 2022 when insurance didn't cover what we'd expected, $3,800, plus the car we'd signed over to Lacey when Connie died, an 18 Accord with 29,000 miles that I'd never seen a dollar for. Rough total over 5 years, just over $190,000. I closed the app, put the phone face down. It was one thing I needed to know before I did anything else. I called Ned Hollis the next morning. Ned did my books for 12 years before I switched to an accountant Brownsburg, and we still have lunch every few weeks at a diner on Route 421 where they know his order. I told him the number's flat, the way you describe a system failure to someone who needs to diagnose it. Ned turned his coffee cup in his hands. You know where your retirement should be right now. I know. Not a judgment. I'm asking if you actually know. I know Ned. He nodded and let it sit there. He's good at leaving things alone. It's probably why he catches fish. What are you going to do? I told him I wasn't sure yet. That was mostly true. Thursday I drove to Hamilton Heights Academy. Asked to speak with someone in the registrar's office about the emergency contact records for Declan and Willa Taggart. The woman I spoke with very politely told me the primary contacts on file were Lacey and Bo Taggart, and the secondary contacts were Alvin and Glenda, Bo's parents. I asked when the secondary contacts had been added. She pulled up the file March of last year, 14 months ago. The same month the wedding photo disappeared from the hallway. Everybody had made a call, given a name, said a number out loud, and the number had not included me. I said thank you and drove home. That Saturday I went to Declan's soccer game. I hadn't been to one in over a year. Nobody had sent me the schedule, and I hadn't thought to look for it myself. I found it on the school's athletics page. Got there 20 minutes early and found a spot in the bleachers. Alvin and Glenda were already set up. Camp chair is a small cooler, a banner with Declan's number in blue letters. When Declan ran onto the field, he spotted them and waved. The big whole arm kind. Then he saw me. He waved again, smaller, not in friendly. The way you wave at someone from church you run into at the grocery store. After the game I went over, he let me hug him. He smelled like cut grass and orange slices. He said, "Hey Grandpa Floyd," easy and without any hesitation. Then Glenda called him over, and he turned to me first and said, "That's Grandma Glenda, and that's Grandpa Alvin." Helpful, graphic. No hidden meaning in it anywhere. Mom says you're kind of like my grandpa from her side, the one who's not around as much. I looked at him for a second. How far away do you think I live? Declan. He shrugged, far like a drive. 14 miles, I said. From your school. He thought about that. That's not that far. No, I said. It isn't. He ran off. I stood on the sideline for a minute. Then I walked to my truck and sat with the windows down and thought about what a 9-year-old does with information. He uses it for about 4 seconds and moves on. That was right. The damage wasn't his. It never was. If any of this is landing somewhere for you, go ahead and like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I mean, Eleanor seems great, but her family is just, I don't know. They're just not our kind of people. Dean said something I couldn't make out. Waverly said, the grandfather especially. He looks like he wandered in from a hardware store. Then, and this is the part that I will remember for the rest of my life, Loretta glanced over. She caught the tail end of what Waverly was saying, and she didn't correct her daughter. She didn't say a word. She just looked at my father for 1/2 second with an expression that I can only describe as agreement. And then she looked away. I felt my wife's hand on my arm under the table. I looked at my father. He was looking down at his plate, His jaw was set. He was doing the thing he always does, taking it, letting it pass over him, choosing not to be disturbed by things that other people would burn down rooms over. He had spent his entire life doing that, and I had spent my entire life watching him do it and thinking it was strength. Sitting there in that restaurant, I realized it wasn't just strength. It was something he'd been carrying alone for a very long time. I took my wife's hand off my arm as gently as I could. I set my napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back. The table went quiet. "I need to say something," I said. I don't remember exactly what I said. I've thought about it a lot since then, and I still can't reconstruct it word for word. What I know is that I looked at Waverly first and then at Loretta. And I said something to the effect that my father had raised me by himself after my mother died, that he had worked every day of his adult life, that he had driven 16 hours round trip to see my daughter graduate when he didn't have to, and that whatever category they had put him in from the moment he walked through the door, based on his shirt, his hands, his truck, his accent, they were wrong. I said they were wrong, and they owed him an apology. Nobody spoke. Loretta opened her mouth, closed it. Waverly looked at the table. I looked at Griffin. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something between respect and paralysis. Then I looked at Eleanor. Her eyes were wet. She gave me the smallest nod, like she was releasing me. I said, "Pop, let's go." My father folded his napkin, placed it beside his plate, said thank you for dinner to no one in particular and no one specifically, which I've always admired about him. The ability to be courteous, even when courtesy is not being extended. He stood up and we walked out. Sylvia caught up with us in the lobby. She'd grabbed both our coats. Eleanor texted me from the table. "I'll call you in the morning. I love you, both of you." We stood outside on Walnut Street for a moment, the three of us. The city was doing what the city does at 9 o'clock on a Thursday, moving lit up and different. My father buttoned his coat. He looked up at the street. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Yeah, I did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good dinner though. Chicken was real good." Sylvia laughed. I didn't, but I wanted to. I drove him back to the hotel. Sylvia went upstairs first, and we sat in the lobby for a while, just the two of us. The way we used to sit at the kitchen table in Dayton when I was a teenager and couldn't sleep. My father ordered a cup of coffee from the bar, even though it was close to 10 o'clock at night, because he has never in his life been affected by caffeine. We didn't talk about what happened at dinner, not directly. We talked about Eleanor's thesis project, which he'd seen photos of and had opinions about from a structural standpoint. We talked about whether the F-150 needed new tires. We talked about a neighbor of his in Dayton who was putting an addition on his house and doing it wrong. When he said out of nowhere, "I want to show you something," he went upstairs and came back down with his duffel bag. He sat next to me on the couch and opened it and took out a manila folder that was thick with papers. He set it on the coffee table. "What is this?" I said. He looked at me. He had an expression I didn't recognize. Not quite nervous, not quite proud. More like someone who has been holding a door closed for a long time and has finally decided to open it. "I haven't told you everything about the business," he said. "I'm going to try to explain this the way he explained it to me, because he didn't lead with the number. That's important. He didn't sit down and say, 'Here's the bottom line.' He started from the beginning, which I think is the only way he knows how to tell a story, and which is probably why it took him until well past midnight to get through it. He started the small parts operation in 1987. With $11,000 he'd saved working at a machine shop. He called it Brock Industrial Supply. He ran it out of a garage in Dayton for the first 3 years. He had 2 clients. He worked 16-hour days and came home and made dinner and was there when I got up every morning that I remember. I just never understood what he was doing in the garage until midnight. By 1995, he had 22 employees and a small warehouse on the west side of Dayton. He had expanded into components for agricultural equipment, which turned out to be a good call because the market for agricultural components in the Midwest was more stable than automotive. By 2001, the year I started at Ohio State, Brock Industrial Supply had annual revenue of just over $4 million. I stared at him. He held up one hand. He wasn't done. He had kept the business private on purpose, not because he was hiding anything, but because he had watched what money did to families. His own father had come into some money in the 70s and had torn his side of the family apart. Who got what? Who deserved more? Who had been overlooked? He didn't want that. He especially didn't want it to touch me. He wanted me to build my own life from my own work, to know what it felt like to earn things, to not have a number in the background distorting every choice I made. So he lived the way he always had. He kept the house in Dayton. He drove the same kind of truck he'd always driven. He ate the same pot roast on Sundays. He gave to his church. He gave anonymously to a food bank in Montgomery County he'd been supporting for nearly 20 years. He had a financial advisor he'd been working with since 1998, a man named Clifford. I remember now that my father mentioned him once when I was in college, and I hadn't thought about it since. In 2019, he sold Brock Industrial Supply to a regional manufacturing conglomerate. He handed me a single page from the folder. It was a summary sheet from the sale. I read the number. I read it again. I put the page down on the coffee table and looked at my father. He was watching me with those steady gray eyes of his waiting. I said, "Pop." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Why are you showing me this now?" He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Because I think you need to know that what happened tonight, what those people think of me, it doesn't change anything. I'm not showing you this to be angry. I'm showing you this because I want you to understand that I've always been fine. I've always been more than fine. I just chose different things." The number on that page was $43 million. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Sylvia in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the things I thought I knew about my life and how many of them needed to be resorted. I thought about the school trips I didn't go on. I thought about the sneakers. I thought about the partial scholarship and the loans and the years after college when I was paying them off a little at a time, and I never once thought to ask my father for help, because it never occurred to me that he could give it. And I realized now that this was exactly what he had wanted. He had built something enormous and then deliberately stood to the side of it, so that I couldn't be sheltered by it, so that I'd have to become someone on my own term. I thought about Loretta and Waverly and their quiet cruelty at dinner. And I thought about the way my father had folded his napkin and said thank you for dinner and meant it, or at least meant the gesture of it. And I understood for the first time that the reason he could do that was because he knew something they didn't know. He wasn't absorbing their contempt because he was powerless. He was absorbing it because it was genuinely, completely beneath him. In the morning, Eleanor called. She was upset. She'd been up most of the night, she said. She'd had a long conversation with Griffin. She told me that she loved him, but that what had happened at dinner had confirmed things she'd been trying not to think too hard about. She said, his family's reaction, not just Waverly, but Loretta's silence. The way no one at that table had said a word in my father's defense, except me, told her something important. I said, "Eleanor, this is your life, your engagement, your decision." She said, "I know, I've made it." I asked her what she meant. She said she'd given Griffin's ring back. That morning, there was a silence on the phone. I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm going to be. I feel honestly, Dad, I feel relieved." "Is that terrible?" "No," I said. "I keep thinking about Grandpa sitting there," she said, "and nobody's saying anything and you standing up. I keep thinking, that's what I want, someone who does that. That's what I've been missing." I told her to come to breakfast. I told her Grandpa was still in town until the afternoon, and he was probably going to want to eat somewhere that didn't require a 2-month reservation. She laughed. It sounded real. My father left Philadelphia at noon. I walked him to his rental car in the hotel parking structure. He had his duffel bag over one shoulder, and his coffee from the lobby in his hand. And he looked exactly like he always looks, completely himself, not performing anything, not bracing for anything. I told him I'd been thinking about everything he'd shown me the night before. He nodded, looking at his car. I told him I didn't know whether to be amazed or angry that he'd kept it from me for 30 years. He said, "How about without neither?" I said, "What then?" He looked at me. "Grateful," he said. "You built something real. You know it's real because you built it without knowing what was behind you. That's not nothing. That's everything." I didn't know what to say to that. I'm not sure there was anything to say. He put his coffee on the roof of the car and gave me a hug, the kind where he holds on for a second longer than I expect, because he always has. Then he got in the car, rolled down the window and said, "Tell Eleanor I love her, I will, and tell her the chicken really was good." I watched him pull out of the parking structure and disappear down the ramp toward the street. It's been 4 months since that dinner. Eleanor is back in Philadelphia, working at a firm in Old City, living in a place she loves, and she seems lighter in a way I can't quite name but can clearly see whenever we talk. She texts my father more than she's ever texted me. He texts back in full sentences, no abbreviations, slightly formal, which is exactly how my father has always communicated in writing, and which Eleanor told me she finds extremely comforting. The Aldermans reached out once, Loretta by email, a week after the dinner. She wrote something carefully worded about how the evening got away from everyone, and how she hoped it wouldn't affect the family's relationship going forward. I wrote back 2 sentences. I said I appreciated her reaching out, and that I wished her and her family well. I didn't say anything more than that, because there wasn't anything more that needed to be said. I talked to Sylvia about my father's money, or rather about the fact of it, which is a different thing from the money itself. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You know what's funny? I always liked him more than your net worth." Suggested I should, which is exactly the kind of thing Sylvia says, and exactly why I married her. I've started calling my father on Sunday evenings. We used to talk every other week or so, which is the natural drift of adult children and parents who both have lives. Now I call every Sunday, usually while he's doing dishes after the pot roast. He doesn't comment on the frequency. He just answers every time on the second ring. A few weeks ago I asked him why he never told me about the sale, about any of it. He was quiet for a moment, the way he is when he's actually thinking about something, rather than preparing an answer. Then he said, "You know how you always want your kid to know they're going to be okay. But you also know that if you tell them too soon, they stop trying to figure it out themselves." "Yeah," I said, "that's all it was." And I thought about my daughter, and about the man she'll eventually choose, and about the Sunday evenings ahead of me, where I'll sit in my kitchen with the window cracked open, and I'll call my father on the phone. And we'll talk about nothing in particular, and it will be exactly enough. That's what I came back to that night in Philadelphia. But folder, before the number, before any of it, I stood up from that table because he is my father, and because some things don't need a reason beyond that. They never did.
My brother yanked the intravenous line straight out of my hand, while our mother stood there with her arms crossed, doing absolutely nothing. He smirked down at me, holding a legal document, certain his corporate connections meant no one would believe a patient over him. Then the nurse stepped inside the room. I saw everything she said, her hand resting on her security radio. The hallway footage has already been saved. His smug face instantly went pale, and my mother scrambled to explain it away, but it was already too late. "My name is Camilla. I am 33 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Cyber, a forensic accounting and cybersecurity firm. To the business world, I am a highly respected auditor. But to my family, I am just the runaway failure who was supposed to be easy to crush. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The sharp tearing of a medical tape and a sudden searing pain snapped me awake. I gasped, clutching my right hand as a bright red stream of blood spilled over the crisp white hospital sheets. Brandon, my 36-year-old brother, threw the plastic tubing aside. He did not even blink at the blood soaking into my blanket. Instead, he slammed a thick stack of legal papers right onto my lap, knocking the breath out of me. Sign the power of attorney, Camilla. Brandon shoved a heavy silver pen against my chest. Do it right now. Do you honestly think Dad left you the controlling shares of the family trust because you are actually competent? He was losing his mind at the end. You are just an arrogant brat who got kicked out of the house at 18. You do not know how to handle real money. I pressed my thumb hard against my bleeding vein, forcing myself to sit up against the hospital bed rails. I looked at the expensive tailored suit he was wearing, a suit paid for by the very trust he was trying to steal. Dad gave me the controlling shares because you bankrupted 2 of his holding companies in exactly 3 years, Brandon. I said, keeping my voice dangerously steady despite the throbbing pain in my hand. You managed to turn a legacy real estate portfolio into a mountain of debt, while I built a national tech auditing firm entirely from scratch. You do not want my help. You want my signature so you can drain whatever is left to save your own skin. From the dark corner of the VIP hospital room, my mother Beatrice stepped forward. She smoothed down her pristine cashmere cardigan and looked at my bleeding hand with utter disgust, acting as if my physical pain was merely an inconvenience to her afternoon schedule. Stop being so incredibly selfish, Camilla, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with that familiar cold disappointment I had known my entire life. Your brother needs those assets to secure a commercial loan. The family business is going through a temporary rough patch, and families are supposed to help each other. Pick up the pen and sign the papers. You have more than enough money from your little computer company anyway. My little computer company. I laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the sterile walls. My firm audits federal contractors, Mom. I literally track stolen money for a living. I am in this hospital bed purely from physical exhaustion after spending 4 consecutive nights untangling the disastrous financial web Brandon created. I know exactly what he did with the commercial accounts. Brandon's face flushed deep red, the veins in his neck bulging. He leaned over the bed, grabbing my hospital gown and pulling me close to his face. You are going to sign this document, or I swear I will have my lawyers tie you up in probate court until your tech firm drowns in legal fees. He spat the words at me, a desperate kind of venom in his eyes. You have always been the difficult one, the ungrateful scapegoat. Just sign the paper and go back to your miserable, independent life. I gripped the pen he had thrown at me, but I did not look at the signature line. I looked right into his eyes, refusing to shrink back the way I did when I was a teenager. You are terrified, Brandon, because for the first time in your life, Mom cannot bail you out, and you have to beg the sister you threw out on the street to save you from federal prison. He raised his hand, his face contorted with rage, fully intending to strike me right there in the hospital bed. Before he could do anything else, the heavy wooden door to my room swung wide open. Jackie, the floor's head nurse, stepped inside carrying a tray of medications. She froze. Her eyes instantly locked onto the blood pooling on my sheets, then moved to the IV line dangling uselessly off the side of the bed, and finally landed on Brandon, whose hand was still clutching the collar of my gown. For a split second, the room was dead silent. Beatrice reacted with the lightning speed of a seasoned manipulator. She immediately gasped, rushing forward with her hands flying to her mouth, playing the role of the distraught, caring mother flawlessly. "Oh, thank goodness you are here, nurse," Beatrice cried out, her voice trembling with perfectly faked panic. My daughter is having a severe mental breakdown. She woke up completely hysterical and ripped her own IV out. My poor son was just trying to restrain her so she would not hurt herself further. Please, you have to give her a sedative. She has always struggled with severe psychiatric episodes. Brandon quickly let go of my gown and smoothed his lapels, adopting a look of exhausted sibling concern. He smirked down at me, a tiny triumphant lifting of the corner of his mouth. He was absolutely certain he had won. He was the wealthy, polished businessman, and Beatrice was the respectable matriarch. Against their combined performance, I was just the erratic patient in a hospital gown. They had played this exact game when I was younger, twisting the truth to make me look like the unstable one, while Brandon walked away clean. But Jackie did not rush to my bedside with a sedative. She did not look at me with pity or suspicion. Instead, she set her medication tray down on the nearest counter with a sharp, deliberate clack. She looked directly at Brandon, her expression hardening into absolute stone. Jackie reached up to the collar of her scrubs and wrapped her fingers around the black security radio clipped there. "I saw him do it," Jackie said, her voice carrying the weight of a seasoned professional who took zero nonsense from anybody. And so did the high-definition camera right outside that door. Brandon's smirk vanished. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. Beatrice stopped her fake crying instantly, her mouth falling open in shock as the reality of the situation crashed down on them. They were not in control anymore. Brandon's panic lasted only a fraction of a second. The arrogant mask snapped back into place so fast it was genuinely terrifying. He let out a sharp, grating laugh and stepped back from the hospital bed. His right hand dived into his tailored suit jacket, pulling out his smartphone. His thumbs flew across the screen with practiced, desperate speed. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was texting Greg, the hospital IT director, a man who owed Brandon tens of thousands of dollars from underground high-stakes poker games. "You always do this," Camilla Beatrice snapped, stepping out of the shadows of the VIP suite and moving to Brandon's side like a loyal guard dog. "You always push your brother to the absolute edge and then play the bleeding victim when he finally reacts. Have you no shame at all?" I pressed a sterile gauze pad against my bleeding hand, keeping my eyes locked on the heart rate monitor next to my bed. The steady, rhythmic beeping was clinical proof that I was not the hysterical woman they were trying to paint me as. "He just assaulted me, Mom." He ripped a needle out of my vein to force a signature on a fraudulent financial document, and you are standing right there defending him, just like you always do. Beatrice sneered, her perfectly manicured hands resting aggressively on her designer handbag. "Brandon has friends everywhere in this city, Camilla. People who actually matter. You learned that the hard way when you were 19, did you not? You actually thought the police would believe a rebellious, ungrateful teenager over a promising young executive." The memory hit me like a physical strike. Brandon drunkenly wrapping his brand new Porsche around a concrete parking pillar, then dragging my unconscious body from the passenger seat and shoving me behind the steering wheel before the sirens arrived. He left me with a permanent scar on my collarbone from the seatbelt. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And you paid the police chief in cash to make his blood alcohol test results vanish from the county records." "We protected the family name," Beatrice corrected coldly, tilting her chin up. "Just like we are protecting the family assets today." His friends made that police report disappear into thin air, just like they will easily handle whatever minor inconvenience this overly dramatic nurse thinks she saw. Heavy footsteps echoed down the polished corridor outside. Two large hospital security guards marched into the room, their expressions hardened and on high alert. Nurse Jackie immediately pointed her finger directly at Brandon's chest. This man just physically assaulted a patient. He violently pulled her intravenous line to force her to sign legal documents against her will. He needs to be detained immediately, and the police must be called. Brandon did not flinch. He slid his phone back into his pocket and casually buttoned his suit jacket, projecting the aura of a calm, deeply concerned executive, dealing with an irrational subordinate. "Officers, please excuse this dramatic display. My sister is suffering from a severe psychiatric episode brought on by extreme exhaustion. Look at her. She is clearly hysterical and a danger to herself. She ripped the line out in a fit of wild paranoia. I was merely trying to hold her hands down to prevent further self-harm." "That is a blatant lie," Jackie stated firmly, crossing her arms. "I witnessed the assault with my own eyes. And the security camera right outside that door captured everything through the observation window." Brandon turned slowly toward the black dome camera mounted in the ceiling corner. He flashed a sickeningly confident white-toothed smile. In fact, I insist you review the security footage right now, officers. Pull the video from the last 10 minutes. It will completely exonerate me and prove that my mother and I are simply trying to manage a deeply unwell family member who needs immediate psychiatric sedation. He checked his phone one last time, seeing a confirmation notification pop up on his glowing screen. His smirk deepened into something truly sinister. The lead security guard tapped the radio on his shoulder, calling down to the central surveillance room in the basement. The entire room waited in suffocating silence. The only sound was the steady beeping of my heart monitor and the quiet, heavy breathing of my mother preparing her next lie. A full minute passed. Then the guard's radio crackled loudly, filling the tense room with sharp static. A frustrated voice responded from the control center. "We have a major problem on floor 4. The local server just suffered a catastrophic partition failure. The entire system crashed exactly 30 seconds ago. All video data from the West Wing for the last hour is totally corrupted. The footage is wiped clean." The lead guard lowered his hand from his radio, looking at Jackie with an apologetic but firm expression. "Without the footage, this is a strictly verbal dispute between family members. We cannot detain a family member acting as a medical proxy without hard physical evidence of an assault." Beatrice let out a loud, theatrical sigh of immense relief, placing a hand dramatically over her heart. "Thank God the truth prevails. You see, officers, this is just a tragic family health crisis. Now, if you would please step outside and give us some much-needed privacy, we have urgent medical and financial matters to discuss with our daughter." The guards hesitated, glancing at the blood on my sheets, but they had no legal authority to intervene without proof. They slowly backed out of the room, instructing Jackie to clean the wound and page the attending physician immediately. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The trap was sprung. Brandon stepped right up to the edge of my hospital bed. He leaned down, his face mere inches from mine, his expensive cologne mixing with the metallic smell of my own blood. He pressed the heavy silver pen back into my palm, his fingers wrapping painfully tight around my bruised knuckles. "I told you exactly how this city works, Camilla," he whispered, his voice dripping with venomous triumph. "I own the servers. I own the people who run them. You lose. Again. Sign the paper right now, or I swear I will have Mom use her medical proxy to commit you to a psychiatric ward for the rest of your natural life." I did not cry. I did not scream. I looked down at my bruised, bloody hand, and then I slowly reached over to the bedside table with my left arm. I picked up my sleek black tablet, the screen dark and cold. I looked back up at Brandon, and a razor-sharp smile spread across my face. I tapped the glass screen twice, waking the device up. "You really think a local server crash is enough to stop me, Brandon?" I asked, holding his gaze as the tablet illuminated the dark corners of the hospital room. "You forgot exactly what I do for a living." I dragged my finger across the smooth glass of my tablet, swiping a file directly onto the hospital room's smart television mounted on the wall. The massive screen flickered to life, bathing the sterile room in a harsh, cold glow. Brandon stared at the monitor, his arrogant posture dissolving into pure panic. Right there, playing in glorious high-definition resolution, was the exact footage his buddy Greg had supposedly just wiped from existence. The video showed Brandon storming into my room, his face contorted in rage. It showed him grabbing my arm violently, yanking the intravenous line from my skin, and shoving the legal documents into my chest. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every single threat he made about taking my tech firm down and forcing me into a psychiatric ward. Brandon stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a medical cart. The metal trays rattled loudly in the quiet room. He pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at the blank screen, as if it had betrayed him. He stammered, his voice cracking. "Greg said he wiped the partition. He told me the local drive was completely formatted. There is no way you have this." I shifted my weight against the pillows, ignoring the throbbing pain in my right hand where Nurse Jackie was now applying a fresh, tight bandage. "You are so incredibly predictable, Brandon," I said, keeping my tone dead flat. "You actually thought your country club drinking buddy could outsmart the chief executive of a forensic cybersecurity firm." Did you not bother to read the hospital newsletter last month? Aegis Cyber was contracted to overhaul this entire facility's security infrastructure. We installed the new system 3 weeks ago. The lead security guard stepped closer to the television, his eyes narrowed as he watched the digital playback of Brandon assaulting me. That local server Greg just destroyed was nothing but a decoy honeypot. I continued, letting every word sink in like a blade. We set it up specifically to trap internal bad actors, trying to tamper with medical records and security feeds. The real surveillance data bypasses the hospital basement entirely. It uploads directly via an encrypted channel to an off-site cloud server that my company owns and monitors 24 hours a day. You did not erase the evidence, Brandon. You just handed me a recorded confession of evidence tampering and conspiracy to commit a felony. Beatrice rushed forward, stepping between the television and the security guards, as if she could physically block them from seeing the truth. Her designer heels clicked frantically against the linoleum. "This is a violation of privacy," Beatrice shouted, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You have illegally recorded a private family conversation. Officers, you need to confiscate that tablet immediately." She is trying to frame her brother because she has always been deeply jealous of his success. I laughed, a sharp sound that made the younger security guard flinch. "Jealous of his success, Mom. He has not had a successful day in his life since you and Dad bought his college degree. He relies on his golf buddies to cover his tracks and clean up his messes, just like he did when he crashed his car at 19, just like he did when he got caught stealing from the country club fund at 25. But this is not the country club, and Greg from IT cannot save him from a federal cloud server." Brandon was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. He looked at the door, clearly calculating whether he could make a run for it before the guards grabbed him. The lead security guard reached for his shoulder radio, his demeanor completely shifted. The hesitation from earlier was gone, replaced by strict professional authority. He glared at Brandon, taking a deliberate step forward to block the exit. "Control, we need the police dispatched to the 4th floor, VIP wing." Immediately the guard said into his radio, never taking his eyes off my brother. "We have confirmed video evidence of a physical assault on a patient, along with admitted destruction of hospital property. Send backup to this room now." Brandon threw his hands up in surrender, retreating until his back hit the cold wall. "Mom, do something," he pleaded, his voice rising in panic. "They cannot arrest me. The holding company investors will find out. The banks will pull the loans. Do something right now." I watched the desperate exchange, feeling a deep, settling calm. For 30 years, I had watched them operate as an untouchable unit, using their wealth and influence to crush anyone who stood in their way. But in this room, surrounded by my technology and undeniable digital proof, their old tactics were utterly useless. "Officer, you do not understand the pressure my son is under," Beatrice pleaded, turning her perfectly practiced tears toward the lead guard. "He is just trying to protect our family business. My daughter is confused. She is sick. She does not understand the damage she is causing." The guard shook his head, pulling a pair of heavy zip ties from his utility belt. "Mom, I am sorry, but your son assaulted a patient and tampered with our security system. He is going to be detained until the police arrive, and there is absolutely nothing you can say that will change that." Brandon let out a pathetic, terrified noise as the guard stepped toward him. He looked like a cornered animal, completely stripped of the arrogant executive persona he wore like armor. But Beatrice did not break down. Instead, the fake tears vanished from her face in a fraction of a second. Her posture straightened, her spine stiffening into absolute rigidity. The panicked, desperate mother routine disappeared, replaced by the cold, calculating predator I knew all too well. If raw manipulation was not going to work, she was going to use the one weapon she always kept in reserve: control. Beatrice calmly reached into her oversized designer leather tote bag. She bypassed her wallet and her makeup, pulling out a thick, legal-sized envelope sealed with a red wax stamp. She ripped the envelope open with one swift motion and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents, waving them directly in the security guard's face. "You cannot arrest him, and you certainly cannot take any statements from my daughter," Beatrice declared, her voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. My son had every legal right to physically restrain her because she is not of sound mind. The security guard paused, glancing at the documents. Excuse me, ma'am. I just watched him assault her. You watched a family member manage a psychiatric emergency. Beatrice fired back, stepping right up to the guard and shoving the papers into his chest. I hold my daughter's full medical and legal proxy. I have the signed documentation right here authenticated by a state judge. As of this moment, I declare Camilla mentally incompetent to make her own decisions, manage her own company, or file any legal charges against her brother. You will not touch my son, and you will call a psychiatric evaluation team into this room immediately. I stared at the thick stack of papers in her hand, my heart slamming against my ribs. The proxy, the ultimate leash she had tried to keep around my neck for years. Brandon slowly lowered his hands, a cruel, vindictive smile returning to his pale face, as he realized his mother had just played her trump card. Beatrice's hand did not even shake as she shoved the crumpled legal document right into the lead security guard's chest. She smoothed her posture, tilting her chin up to project absolute authority. You will not lay a finger on my son, she commanded, her voice ringing off the sterile hospital walls. I am this patient's mother, and I hold her complete medical and legal proxy. Camilla is suffering from severe acute paranoia. Her claims about cloud servers and assaults are nothing but the psychotic delusions of an exhausted, unstable mind. Beatrice turned her glare toward Nurse Jackie. I am invoking my rights under this proxy. I demand you administer a heavy sedative immediately. She is a danger to herself and to my son. Put her to sleep before her delusions cause any more legal trouble for this family. Jackie stood her ground, her eyes narrowing at the piece of paper, but the security guards exchanged uncertain glances. A medical proxy was a powerful legal tool. It was the ultimate trump card in a hospital setting. Brandon, sensing the shift in power, adjusted his cuffs and let out a long, theatrical sigh. It breaks my heart to see my sister like this. He lied perfectly. She works herself into these manic episodes, making up wild conspiracy theories about me just to get attention. Please, nurse, just give her the injection so she can finally rest. I did not scream. I pushed myself up higher against my pillows, ignoring the throbbing pain in my bandaged hand. You really do not have a single new trick in your entire playbook, do you, Mom? I asked, my voice cutting through their manufactured drama like ice. Beatrice stiffened. Be quiet, Camilla. The adults are handling your care now. I locked my eyes on hers. You pulled this exact same stunt 10 years ago. Have you forgotten? I have not. I was 18 years old. You dragged me into a private clinic claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own finances. You convinced a corrupt doctor I was having a breakdown just so you could gain control of the college fund Dad left me. Brandon looked away, staring at the floor, but I refused to let him hide. And what did you do with my tuition money, Mom? Did you hold it for my recovery? No. You drained every single cent of it 24 hours later to bail Brandon out of his first disastrous tech startup. You took $200,000 of my money and handed it to a son who blew it on luxury cars and bad software code within 6 months. You stole my education to pay off his gross negligence. And you used a fake psychiatric evaluation as the weapon to do it. Beatrice stepped closer to my bed, her eyes flashing with defensive rage. Your brother had a legitimate business opportunity that needed capital. You were just an ungrateful teenager who wanted to study computers. We made a financial decision for the greater good of the family name. And clearly, based on your erratic behavior today, I made the right choice regarding your mental competency back then. She turned back to the security guards. She is proving my point right now. She harbors deep paranoid resentments against her own flesh and blood. Restrain her and sedate her before she hurts someone. The lead security guard looked at the paper in Beatrice's hand, clearly torn between hospital protocol and the bizarre scene unfolding in front of him. Liability was a massive issue, and an anxious mother holding a legal proxy document was usually enough to force the staff's hand. Mom, if this proxy is legally binding, we have to comply with the family medical directives, he warned quietly, taking a reluctant step toward my bed. We cannot risk a lawsuit if the patient is officially under your care and refuses mandatory treatment. Brandon smirked again, that familiar, sickening expression of victory returning to his face. He actually crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall, enjoying the spectacle of my impending helplessness. "You heard him, nurse." Brandon sneered, his voice dropping into a mocking, soothing tone. "Time for little sister to go to sleep. Do not make us force you to cooperate, Camilla. It will only make you look crazier when the doctor finally arrives." Before Jackie could even respond, the heavy sound of leather dress shoes clicking against the corridor floor echoed into the room. The footsteps were purposeful, measured, and carried absolute authority. A tall, imposing man in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit walked through the doorway. He did not look at the security guards. He did not look at Brandon. He walked straight up to Beatrice. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and resonant. Before my mother could react, he reached out and snatched the proxy document right out of her manicured fingers. "Hey, you cannot touch that! That is a confidential legal document!" Beatrice shrieked, reaching out to grab it back. The man easily sidestepped her. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the paragraphs on the page for exactly 3 seconds. Then, in one smooth, deliberate motion, he gripped the top of the paper and ripped it straight down the middle. Beatrice gasped. Brandon lunged forward, shouting, "Are you out of your mind? I will have you arrested for destroying a legal medical directive." The man casually dropped the shredded halves of my mother's fake proxy onto the hospital floor, letting the pieces flutter over Brandon's expensive leather shoes. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed blue folder, handing it gently to me. "I am Donovan," he stated, turning his sharp gaze back to my mother. "I am the chief legal counsel for this hospital network. And Mrs. Beatrice, that piece of paper you just tried to enforce is entirely fraudulent. Camilla's actual medical and legal proxy is my firm. We have held it securely for the past 5 years." He stepped closer to Beatrice, towering over her. "And as her legal representatives, we are officially pressing charges against you right now for egregious HIPAA violations, falsifying medical documents, and attempted medical fraud." Brandon stared blankly at the shredded pieces of thick parchment scattered across the sterile hospital floor. His mother's ultimate weapon, the fraudulent medical proxy that was supposed to permanently chain me to a psychiatric bed, was now nothing but expensive confetti. Donovan stood between my hospital bed and my family, like an impenetrable fortress, radiating the kind of absolute quiet power that came from billing thousands of dollars an hour. Brandon's arrogant mask completely dissolved into raw, unadulterated panic. He stumbled backward, putting physical distance between himself and the hospital's chief legal counsel. His hands shook violently as he yanked his smartphone from his suit pocket and hit a speed dial button. He raised the phone to his ear, his eyes darting frantically around the room. "Get up here right now," Brandon hissed into the receiver, his voice tight with desperation. He did not wait for a response, immediately hanging up and shoving the phone back into his pocket. He needed backup. He needed the one person in his life whose capacity for manipulation rivaled our mother's. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy wooden door to the VIP suite flew open. Nia, Brandon's wife, burst into the room. She was a walking, breathing billboard for generational wealth, draped in a pristine white Chanel blazer, her wrists glittering with heavy Cartier bangles that clinked loudly in the tense silence. She had clearly been waiting downstairs in the hospital's luxury lounge, ready to pop champagne the moment Brandon successfully forced my signature. Nia stopped dead in her tracks, her sharp eyes instantly assessing the disaster in front of her. She took in the shredded documents on the floor, Brandon's pale, sweating face, the stern presence of Donovan, and the security guards standing at attention. Like a seasoned, masterful actress stepping directly onto a brightly lit stage, Nia's entire demeanor transformed in a fraction of a second. Her perfectly squared shoulders slumped. Her lower lip trembled flawlessly. Tears sprang to her eyes on command, glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Oh, my poor Camilla!" Nia cried out, rushing forward with her hands clasped together, though she was very careful to stop a safe distance away from the blood soaking my hospital gown. She turned her tear-filled, devastated eyes directly toward Donovan and the security guards, completely ignoring my presence. "Please, you have to understand the tragedy of this situation. My sister-in-law is deeply, deeply unwell." She has been projecting her intense paranoia onto my husband for years. Donovan did not move a single muscle, his expression remaining completely unreadable behind his glasses. Nia pressed a hand to her chest, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken family member with sickening perfection. Camilla is a severely lonely woman. Nia continued, her voice dripping with toxic manufactured pity. She buried herself in her computers and her auditing work because she has absolutely no one in her life. No husband, no children, no real connections. She has always been dangerously obsessed with ruining our perfect marriage. She cannot stand that Brandon has a beautiful family and a thriving career, while she has nothing but her empty bank accounts and her delusions. This entire display is just a desperate, psychotic cry for attention. Beatrice immediately stepped up beside her daughter-in-law, nodding in solemn agreement. Exactly. She is trying to tear this family apart out of pure, bitter spite. I let Nia finish her grand performance. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, allowing her fake tears to dry up. Then I adjusted my position against the pillows, ignoring the throbbing pain in my bandaged hand, and leaned forward slightly. A perfect marriage. I repeated, my voice steady, stripped of any emotion and echoing loudly in the quiet room. That is an incredibly interesting way to describe a union built entirely on stolen money and corporate fraud. Do not listen to her, Nia said quickly, shooting a panicked glance at Donovan. She is completely delusional. Am I, Nia? I asked, holding her gaze until she was forced to look back at me. Then, let us talk about your highly publicized, supposedly self-made luxury real estate firm. Platinum Estates, isn't it? The boutique firm you flaunt in every society magazine in the city? The one you claim to have built with your own brilliant independent business acumen. Nia's jaw tightened, the manufactured sympathy vanishing from her face. 4 years ago, Platinum Estates was carrying $8 million in highly toxic debt, I stated, laying out the facts with clinical precision. You over-leveraged yourself on 2 massive commercial properties that completely tanked. The banks were literally days away from seizing your assets and publicly foreclosing on your precious, perfect life. But then a miraculous silent investor swooped in, bought out your debt through a blind trust, and injected enough capital to keep your doors open and your designer wardrobe funded. Nia's eyes widened, her pristine white blazer suddenly looking entirely too tight. Did you honestly never question where that money came from? Nia, I asked, tilting my head. Did you genuinely think a financial angel just fell from the sky to save your vanity project? I am the sole owner of Apex Holdings, the shell company that holds 80% of your firm's equity. I am your majority shareholder. I own your lavish offices, I own your exclusive listings, and I own your pristine public reputation. Brandon whipped his head around, staring at his wife in absolute shock. What is she talking about, Nia? Is that true? Nia opened her mouth, stammering, her polished exterior fracturing into a million pieces. I funded you because despite your insufferable arrogance, I wanted to keep the family name out of a messy public bankruptcy court. I continued driving the final nail into the coffin. But considering you just strutted into my hospital room to help my brother gaslight me into a locked psychiatric ward, I am officially exercising my contractual right to dissolve our partnership. I am pulling my capital entirely. Platinum Estates goes into forced liquidation at exactly 5 p.m. today. The transition was instant and terrifying. The fake tears vanished. The delicate, victimized posture evaporated, replaced by a raw, feral panic. The heavy gold bracelets rattled violently as Nia's hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. You vindictive witch! Nia snarled, her voice dropping an octave, completely abandoning the concerned sister act. You cannot do this to me. I built that company from the ground up. I am the face of that brand. You cannot just snap your fingers and take it away. I already did, I replied flatly. Nia let out a harsh, mocking laugh, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unrestrained spite. She stepped aggressively toward the hospital bed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger right at my face. You think you have me cornered? Nia shouted, her voice echoing down the hallway. You think you are so smart with your little audits and your secret holding companies? You cannot touch my business, Camilla. Brandon just transferred $2 million in liquid cash from the family trust directly into my private LLC this morning. We do not need your money anymore. We are fully capitalized and we are completely untouchable. A dead heavy silence descended upon the hospital room. Brandon let out a strangled gasp, burying his face in his hands, as he realized exactly what his wife had just done. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I looked past Nia, past my hyperventilating brother, past my horrified mother, and locked eyes with the two hospital security guards standing firmly by the door. "I want to thank you, Nia," I said, my voice ringing with absolute ringing clarity. "I really do." Nia frowned, her pointing finger dropping slightly. "Thank me for what?" I raised my uninjured arm and pointed directly at the solid black rectangular devices mounted securely on the chest plates of both security guards' uniforms. The small red recording lights were blinking steadily in the dim room. "Thank you for explicitly confessing to federal wire fraud, money laundering, and the illegal embezzlement of trust funds on a recorded high-definition hospital body camera." Brandon lunged forward with the sheer blind desperation of a drowning man. He grabbed Nia violently by the shoulders, his fingers digging viciously into her pristine white Chanel blazer, and gave her a brutal shake. "Shut your mouth!" he roared, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "Do not say another word. You stupid, ignorant woman, shut your mouth right now." Nia shrieked in terror, stumbling backward as her heavy gold Cartier bangles clattered harshly against the metal rails of my hospital bed. The two security guards did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They moved with practiced, synchronized efficiency, grabbing Brandon by the arms and physically ripping him away from his wife. He thrashed against their iron grip, his tailored suit jacket tearing at the shoulder seam with a loud rip. But the guards easily overpowered him, slamming him face first against the cold tile wall and pinning his arms behind his back. Donovan simply adjusted his glasses, watching the absolute destruction of the golden boy with the detached clinical interest of a scientist observing a lab rat. "Please keep talking," Donovan instructed casually, pointing a polished finger directly at the blinking red light on the lead guard's chest plate. "This is all highly relevant for the federal authorities." I reached over to the bedside table with my uninjured left arm and pulled my sleek silver laptop from my leather work bag. My right hand throbbed in angry protest, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins completely masked the pain. I flipped the screen open, typed in my decryption password with rapid one-handed keystrokes, and turned the high-definition display outward so the entire room could see it. "Take a good look, Brandon," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic, heavy breathing of my family members. "This is not a local hospital server. This is a live, real-time forensic audit of the primary family holding company run through Aegis Cyber's proprietary tracking software." The large screen illuminated the dim hospital room with cascading columns of financial data. Bright red alerts flashed next to dozens of offshore routing numbers, shell company registries, and dummy corporate accounts. A complex node graph pulsed in the center of the screen, tracking massive sums of money moving across the globe. To a layperson, it was an overwhelming, incomprehensible wall of complex accounting code. But to Brandon, it was an immediate, undeniable death sentence. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost pinned against the wall. "You have spent this entire afternoon telling everyone that I am in this hospital bed because I am a hysterical, paranoid woman having a mental breakdown." I continued, my tone clinically, cold and absolute. "You told Mom I was just exhausted from running my little computer company. You tried to convince these officers that my exhaustion was a symptom of psychiatric instability. But that is not why my body collapsed, is it?" I swung my legs over the side of the hospital bed, planting my bare feet firmly on the cold floor, refusing to look like a patient for 1 second longer. "I am in this hospital because I spent 72 hours straight without a single minute of sleep, tracking the exact digital footprint of $4 million. I stated, enunciating every single syllable so the body cameras would catch it perfectly. $4 million in federal infrastructure grants that were deposited into the family trust last quarter. grants that were explicitly earmarked to fund the city's new commercial development project. Instead of building anything, you systematically siphoned every last cent of that federal money. You used cryptocurrency tumblers to hide the origins, routed the funds through 12 different offshore accounts in Cyprus and the Caymans, washed it through fake vendor invoices for concrete and steel that never existed, and then dumped 2 million of it directly into your wife's failing real estate LLC this morning. Nia let out a muffled, horrified sob. She clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room as the reality of her impending prison sentence finally set in. Her lavish lifestyle was funded by stolen federal tax dollars, and she had just bragged about it on tape. I pointed down at the shredded pieces of parchment still scattered across the linoleum floor right where Donovan had dropped them. "And that brings us to the real reason you were so desperate to get my signature today," I said, staring directly into Brandon's terrified wide eyes. "That document you tried to force me to sign while I was unconscious was not just a simple power of attorney. It was not a medical proxy. It was a backdated corporate resolution." Brandon squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face away, but the security guard held him firmly in place. "You drafted a fraudulent executive order that would have officially named me as the chief financial officer of your specific division, backdated to exactly 2 years ago," I explained, making sure the legal severity of the trap was laid bare. "You knew the federal auditors were closing in. You knew the Department of Justice was preparing to raid the family offices by the end of the week. If I had signed that paper, I would have legally accepted full, unquestionable responsibility for the missing $4 million. With one stroke of my pen, you would have made me the sole authorizer of those wire transfers. You were going to let federal agents march into this hospital room, slap cuffs on my wrists, and send your own sister to a federal penitentiary for 20 years, just so you could keep playing pretend as a successful businessman." Beatrice had been standing in the corner of the room, completely frozen in a state of catatonic shock. For the first time in my entire life, her mask of pristine, calculated control was completely obliterated. Her mouth hung slightly open. She looked back and forth between the cascading red numbers on my laptop screen and Brandon's defeated, pinned body. The realization hit her like a runaway freight train. She was not just protecting a reckless son anymore. She had been actively manipulated into participating in a massive federal crime. Her own son had used her to try and frame me, putting the entire family empire and her own personal freedom directly in the crosshairs of the United States government. Beatrice gasped, her hands flying to her throat. She stumbled forward, her designer bag slipping from her shoulder and crashing to the floor. Her eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated horror as she turned her vicious glare toward the golden child she had protected for 3 decades. "You told me the feds were auditing Camilla's accounts, not yours," Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, panicked betrayal as she realized she had been nothing but a pawn in his scheme. "Shut up!" Brandon screamed, thrashing wildly against the security guards in a blind, mindless rage. "Shut your mouth! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!" He glared wildly at his mother, his chest heaving, his face a mask of furious desperation. He did not even realize what he had just done. In his absolute terrified panic to silence our mother, he had just loudly, completely, and undeniably confirmed his own guilt on a recorded high-definition hospital body camera. Brandon's scream echoed off the sterile walls of the VIP hospital suite, vibrating with the horrifying clarity of a man who had just sealed his own fate. The 2 security guards did not flinch, their body cameras capturing every bead of sweat on his forehead, and the absolute terror widening his eyes. The glowing red recording lights seemed to magnify in the dim room, acting as silent judges to the collapse of the golden boy. Donovan remained perfectly still, a marble statue of legal consequence, watching the self-destruction with clinical precision. The silence that followed was suffocating. Brandon slowly let his head fall back against the cold tile, his chest heaving, as the reality of his impromptu confession settled over him. He had just admitted to federal embezzlement in front of a hospital attorney, 2 security guards, and his own sister. Beatrice was the first to break the heavy silence. Decades of meticulously preserving her social standing kicked in, overriding any residual maternal instinct. She took a slow, calculated step away from Brandon physically and metaphorically, severing her ties to her son. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk blouse, her trembling hands giving away the intense panic boiling just beneath the surface. Her eyes darted from Brandon to me and finally settled on Donovan. She let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, pressing her manicured fingers against her collarbone. I had absolutely no idea, Beatrice cried, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. I swear to you, Mr. Donovan, I am completely innocent in all of this. My son lied to me. He manipulated me. He told me Camilla was suffering from severe mental illness and needed an intervention. He said her accounts were under a routine tax audit, and he was just trying to protect the family name. I am a victim of his deceit. She turned her pleading gaze toward the security guard, stepping further away from Brandon, as if his guilt were a contagious disease. I am just a mother who trusted her son. He used my love against me. I have nothing to do with any stolen federal grants or offshore accounts. I would never participate in corporate fraud. You have to believe me, Camilla. I was just trying to get you medical help because he convinced me you were losing your mind. A low, guttural sound erupted from Brandon's throat. It started as a wet cough and quickly escalated into a full manic laugh. The sound was deeply unsettling, bouncing off the walls and cutting through Beatrice's desperate performance. Brandon pushed himself off the tile wall, ignoring the firm grip of the security guards. His expensive suit was torn, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, but he looked directly at his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. A victim. Brandon barked, his laughter dying, instantly replaced by a vicious snarl. You are a victim, Mom. Are you actually going to stand there and play the innocent, manipulated dowager? You think you can throw me to the wolves to save your own skin after everything we did together? Beatrice's face drained of all color. Brandon, stop talking. You are unwell. You are hysterical. I am the clearest I have been in my entire life, Brandon shouted, straining forward. I watched the digital tracking software on my laptop screen, but I did not need the audit trail to confirm what was coming next. Brandon was about to do my work for me. Let us talk about your innocence, Mom. Let us talk about where that federal money actually went, Brandon sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Did you think I was just going to take the fall alone? I am not the only one who benefited from those infrastructure grants. Tell them about the $500,000 you needed by the end of Q3. Tell them how you blew through your personal trust allowance at the baccarat tables in Macau and owed a small fortune to private lenders who do not send polite collection notices. Beatrice raised a hand, stepping backward. That is a lie. That is a filthy, disgusting lie. It is on the ledger, Brandon screamed. $500,000 of stolen federal tax money washed through the corporate accounts and deposited directly into your private wealth fund to cover your gambling debts. And let us not forget your gorgeous new luxury condo in the historic district. How do you think you paid for that in cash? I funneled the embezzled grant money right into your escrow account to close the deal. You knew exactly where that money was coming from because you sat in my office and demanded I find a way to liquidate the corporate assets to cover your tracks. You are just as guilty as I am. The color completely vanished from Beatrice's face. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The impeccably groomed matriarch of the family had been stripped bare, her elegant facade ripped away to reveal the greedy, desperate reality underneath. She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror, searching for any shred of the daughter she had spent decades belittling. I just stared back, my face an impenetrable mask of calm. I turned my laptop screen slightly, allowing the cascading lines of the digital audit to reflect in my mother's horrified eyes. Brandon is right, Mom, I said quietly. The transactions are fully documented. The offshore routing numbers connect directly to your condo's escrow and your private wealth manager. The federal investigators already have the entire paper trail. You did not just turn a blind eye. You actively spent stolen taxpayer money to fund your illegal gambling addiction. While Brandon and Beatrice stood paralyzed by their mutual destruction, screaming accusations at each other in the center of the room, Nia realized the ship was rapidly sinking. Her Platinum Estates empire was dissolved, her husband was going to federal prison, and her mother-in-law was going down with him. The perfect, wealthy life she had so ruthlessly maintained was evaporating in real time. Nia slowly, silently took a step backward. She kept her eyes fixed on the screaming match, sliding her expensive designer bag over her shoulder. She took another quiet step, slipping her phone into her pocket, her expensive heels making no sound against the linoleum. She just needed to get to the elevators. If she could get to her car, she could call her own lawyers, drain whatever clean accounts she had left, and distance herself before the federal agents arrived. She reached her hand backward, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal handle of the heavy wooden hospital door. She turned the knob slowly, pulling the door inward, ready to bolt into the corridor. A firm, heavy hand slammed flat against the center of the wood, pushing the door forcefully shut with a loud, resounding thud. Nia gasped, whipping her head around. Nurse Jackie stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her scrubs, her expression completely devoid of the sympathy she had shown earlier. Her eyes were hard and uncompromising. Going somewhere, Nurse Jackie asked, her voice ringing out clearly over Brandon and Beatrice's argument. The police are waiting in the lobby for a luxury broker matching your exact description. Nurse Jackie stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her scrubs, her expression completely devoid of the sympathy she had shown earlier. Her eyes were hard and uncompromising. Going somewhere, Nurse Jackie asked, her voice ringing out clearly over Brandon and Beatrice's argument. The police are waiting in the lobby for a luxury broker matching your exact description. Nia stood frozen, her manicured hands still hovering in the air near the door handle. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied contouring looking like a harsh painted mask. The reality of those words crashed over her, snapping her survival instincts into high gear. Nia was a predator at heart, and a cornered predator always looks for a way to chew off its own limb to escape a trap. She slowly turned away from the heavy wooden door, her eyes locking directly onto me. The panicked feral look vanished, replaced instantly by the calculating, dead-eyed stare of a woman ready to make a deal. She walked right past Beatrice, entirely ignoring her mother-in-law's hyperventilating, and marched straight toward my hospital bed. "Camilla, listen to me," Nia said, her voice dropping to an urgent conspiratorial whisper. "You and I both know Brandon is an idiot. He is reckless and arrogant. But I have the actual keys to the kingdom. I know exactly where the rest of the money is buried." Brandon's head snapped up. "Nia, what are you doing? Shut up." Nia did not even glance in his direction. "I can give you the master logins, Camilla," she urged, leaning slightly over the bed rails. "I have the authentication tokens for Brandon's secret offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. There is another $6 million sitting in a blind trust under a corporate proxy. If you call off the police, if you give me full immunity, and let me walk out of this hospital right now, I will hand over every single account number and password. You can have it all. Just let me go." Brandon strained against the security guards, his eyes bulging with absolute terror. "You traitor," he spat, struggling violently against their grip. "I gave you everything." Nia scoffed, her gaze remaining fixed exclusively on me. "You gave me a sinking ship, Brandon. I am just grabbing a life vest." "Well, Camilla, do we have a deal?" I looked at my sister-in-law, marveling at her absolute lack of loyalty. It was almost impressive how quickly she was willing to trade her husband for a get-out-of-jail-free card. I closed my laptop screen with a soft click and picked up my silver iPad from the bedside table. "That is a very generous offer, Nia," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "There is just one small problem. I do not need your master logins." Nia frowned, her heavily mascaraed eyelashes fluttering in confusion. "What do you mean?" "Those accounts are encrypted. You cannot touch them without the physical authentication tokens." I tapped the screen of my iPad, bringing up a highly detailed 50-page forensic banking report. "I bypassed the encryption protocols yesterday afternoon while you were busy picking out your outfit for this little hospital intervention," I explained, keeping my tone deadly calm. "You really should not use the same master password for your Cayman accounts that you use for your Platinum Estates corporate email. It took my auditing software less than 12 minutes to crack it. I have already frozen the assets and routed the primary ledgers directly to the Department of Justice." Nia took a staggering step backward. Her hands began to shake again, the heavy Cartier bangles clinking together like a warning bell. And do not try to play the innocent, manipulated wife. I continued leaning forward against the pillows to ensure she heard every single word. You were not just blindly accepting Brandon's stolen cash. You were the primary laundering vehicle. I tracked every single transaction. You used your commercial real estate license to wash that federal grant money through fake property sales. You drafted heavily inflated appraisals on empty, worthless dirt lots in the warehouse district. You set up a daisy chain of shell companies to buy those lots from each other, artificially driving up the market value and skimming the clean laundered cash right off the top. Brandon stopped struggling. The room went dead silent save for the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. You are a licensed broker, Nia, I stated, locking my eyes onto hers. You knowingly committed real estate fraud, wire fraud, and federal money laundering. You did not just benefit from the crime. You engineered the cover-up. The feds have the property deeds. They have your forged appraisal documents, and they have the exact timestamps of when you moved the dirty money into your personal LLC. You are not getting immunity. You are getting a matching orange jumpsuit. Nia's breathing turned ragged. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying hollow realization. She slowly turned her head toward Brandon, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. You promised me they were untraceable. Nia screamed, the sound tearing through her throat. You swore to me that the offshore proxies were completely secure. Brandon opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. Nia did not give him a chance to recover. With a feral, ear-piercing shriek, she lunged directly at her husband. She threw her entire body weight at him, her manicured hands transforming into claws as she went straight for his face. The two security guards immediately broke their hold on Brandon to intercept Nia, creating a chaotic, violent tangle of limbs. You ruined my life! Nia shrieked, thrashing wildly as the guards dragged her backward. You promised me we were safe. I am going to kill you, Brandon. Brandon stumbled backward to avoid his wife's frantic, swinging arms. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the slick hospital linoleum. He flailed wildly, losing his balance and crashing hard against the edge of a medical cart. As he slammed into the metal tray, his suit jacket flew open. His smartphone, the one he had used just minutes prior to call Nia into the room, slipped out of his breast pocket. The expensive device hit the hard floor with a sharp crack, sliding across the tiles and coming to a dead stop exactly 3 feet from my hospital bed. For a split second, everyone in the room froze, breathing heavily, as they stared down at the phone resting on the floor. Right at that exact moment, a sharp, crisp, highly distinct notification ping echoed from my bedside table. I looked down at the silver iPad resting on my lap. A bright green progress bar had just reached 100% across the center of the screen. A large, bold notification box popped up. Data cloning complete. I read aloud, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy tension in the room. I looked down at Brandon's phone on the floor, then back up to his utterly terrified face. You really should remember to turn off your automatic Bluetooth pairing when you walk into a room with a forensic auditor, Brandon. I just downloaded your entire text history. Brandon scrambled across the sterile linoleum floor, his fingers frantically clawing at his dropped smartphone. He snatched the device up and jammed his thumb repeatedly against the power button, his breath hitching in his throat like a trapped animal. He was desperate to shut it off, to somehow magically sever the digital connection before his entire life was exposed. But the damage was already permanently sealed inside the hard drive of the silver iPad, resting calmly on my lap. I tapped the glowing green notification on my screen. A massive, perfectly categorized archive of text messages, encrypted chat logs, hidden emails, and deleted photographs instantly populated my display. Brandon had always been a paranoid digital hoarder. He operated under the pathetic delusion that collecting other people's dirty secrets made him a powerful man. He never realized that storing a treasure trove of criminal evidence on an unsecured personal device just made him a walking liability. I scrolled through the newly acquired data, my eyes rapidly scanning the meticulously organized folders he had kept hidden from the world. One specific password-protected file immediately caught my attention. It was boldly labeled as an insurance policy. I bypassed the simple lock screen with a few quick keystrokes. Inside was a collection of high-resolution screenshots capturing private text conversations. "What do we have here?" I murmured. I intentionally projected my voice so every single person in the room could hear the cold, sharp edge of satisfaction in my tone. "It looks like you do not even trust your own mother, Brandon. You actually kept screenshots of her private, highly confidential text messages to Arthur Pendleton." Beatrice froze entirely. The deep, angry flush that had rushed to her face during her vicious screaming match with Brandon vanished in a heartbeat. She looked exactly as if she had just been struck by lightning. She turned her wide, terrified eyes toward me, her perfectly manicured hands trembling uncontrollably by her sides. Arthur Pendleton was the family's old estate lawyer. He was a corrupt, morally bankrupt attorney who had conveniently retired to a private island shortly after my father passed away. I adjusted my grip on the iPad, locking my gaze onto my mother's horrified face, and began reading the text exchange aloud for the room. "This is a message sent directly from Beatrice to Arthur, dated exactly 2 days after Dad suffered his final fatal stroke. It reads as follows: Arthur, the new draft is completely ready." I guided his hand to sign the signature line myself while he was sleeping. He is too heavily medicated to know the difference. You need to file this fraudulent document immediately and absolutely destroy the previous version. If Camilla finds out she has majority voting rights, she will dismantle everything we built. I lowered the iPad slowly. The sheer, breathtaking magnitude of her betrayal settled over me. I did not feel a shred of the old childhood pain. I did not feel the sting of the unloved daughter. Instead, I felt a burning, purifying fire of absolute vindication. "You forged his signature," I said, my voice striking the quiet room like a heavy iron hammer. "You sat by your dying husband's hospital bed, wrapped his weak, unconscious fingers around a luxury pen, and explicitly stole my entire inheritance." Beatrice took a staggering, unstable step backward. She shook her head in frantic, jerky motions, her expensive silk blouse clinging to her sweating chest. "No," Beatrice gasped out, her voice barely a whisper. "That is not true. You are lying. You are making this up." I slid my legs completely off the edge of the hospital mattress, planting my bare feet firmly onto the cold floor. I ignored the screaming pain in my bandaged hand and stood up to my full height, refusing to look like a helpless patient for 1 second longer. "Dad never left the company to Brandon." I stated, my words echoing with undeniable, crushing authority. "He knew exactly what Brandon was. Dad knew his precious golden boy was a reckless, incompetent liability who would completely bankrupt the family name within a decade. Dad left the primary holding company to me. He left me the majority shares and the absolute executive control because he knew I was the only person with the brains and the discipline to actually run it." "But you could not stand that, could you, Mom?" I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to back up until her shoulders hit the wall. "You could not stomach the idea that the daughter you spent my entire life treating like a worthless scapegoat would suddenly hold the keys to the kingdom." I continued, stripping away decades of her toxic manipulation. "You could not let the invisible, disappointing child have financial power over your precious, spoiled son. So you committed felony fraud. You stole my birthright and handed it to a man who blew every single cent of it on luxury cars, terrible investments, and federal embezzlement." Beatrice's chest heaved violently. Her carefully styled hair was coming undone, stray blonde strands falling across her face as her false reality shattered into pieces. She pointed a violently shaking finger at my iPad. "That is a lie," Beatrice shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical, desperate pitch. "Digital files can be manipulated. You are a professional computer auditor. You hacked into his phone and planted those fake screenshots just to frame me because you have always been jealous of us. You have absolutely no real proof. I demand to see physical proof right now." Nia, who was still pinned against the far wall by the hospital security guards, watched the absolute destruction of her mother-in-law with wide, shell-shocked eyes. She finally realized the depth of the corruption she had married into. Brandon remained motionless on his knees in the center of the room, clutching his useless phone to his chest, completely and utterly broken. I did not even need to open my mouth to respond to my mother's pathetic, desperate demands. The heavy, sharp sound of Donovan unlatching the brass locks of his thick blue leather briefcase filled the tense, suffocating silence of the VIP suite. Donovan stepped forward, moving with the terrifying, unbothered grace of an apex predator. He positioned himself directly beside my hospital bed, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He reached his large hand into the briefcase and retrieved a pristine, heavy manila envelope. The back flap was secured with thick crimson wax. Across the front of the heavy parchment, a highly official, elaborate seal had been embossed directly into the paper. He held the envelope up smoothly, ensuring the harsh hospital lights caught the gleaming metallic seal of the State Supreme Court. "You are absolutely right," Beatrice Donovan said, his deep, resonant voice radiating absolute, uncompromising legal authority. "Digital evidence can sometimes be challenged in a court of law, which is exactly why we do not need to rely on it today." Beatrice stared blankly at the thick envelope, her mouth opening and closing silently as the last shred of her defense evaporated into thin air. "Your late husband was a highly intelligent and very cautious man." Donovan continued, his gaze pinning my mother against the wall. "He knew exactly what you were maneuvering behind his back. He filed a secret original copy of his true will directly with my firm exactly 3 days before he died." The heavy parchment of the true will seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of the room. Beatrice stared at the crimson wax seal as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Her knees finally gave out. She slid down the sterile white wall, her expensive silk blouse crumpling as she hit the floor in a heap of absolute defeat. The matriarch, who had ruled the family with an iron fist for decades, was reduced to a hyperventilating mess, clutching her chest as the reality of her impending incarceration set in. Brandon did not fall. Instead, the final shattering of his fraudulent empire triggered a terrifying cornered animal response. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, ignoring the security guards who instinctively stepped forward to restrain him. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, darting wildly around the room, before locking onto me with a hatred so pure it practically radiated off his skin. He had no legal standing, no money, and federal agents were waiting just an elevator ride away. He was entirely out of options. Or so he thought. "You think you have won?" Brandon hissed, his voice dropping an octave into a gravelly, demonic register. "You think this piece of paper changes anything? I am the face of this family. I am the CEO. You are just the pathetic, isolated sister who plays with computers in the dark." He reached a shaking hand inside the breast pocket of his ruined suit jacket. The 2 security guards immediately stepped between us, their hands reaching for their utility belts, anticipating a weapon. I raised my uninjured hand, signaling them to stop and step back. I wanted to see exactly how deep his depravity went. Brandon pulled out a sleek, matte black flash drive. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger like a dark talisman, a sickening smirk twisting his sweaty features. "You like digital audits?" Camilla Brandon taunted, taking a menacing step toward the foot of my bed. "You like digging through files and pretending you are untouchable? Let us talk about what is actually on this drive. I have spent the last 6 months anticipating that you might try to stage a pathetic little coup. I hired the most expensive, morally bankrupt digital artists on the dark web to create an ultimate insurance policy." Nia, still restrained by the guards against the far wall, stopped thrashing and stared at her husband in horror. Even she did not know about this. "This drive contains over 500 gigabytes of highly illegal, exquisitely crafted, deep-faked material." Brandon boasted, his voice echoing in the quiet suite. "It features your face, your voice, and your digital signature, orchestrating offshore money laundering for sanctioned terrorist organizations. There are video files of you supposedly negotiating the sale of classified corporate data to foreign intelligence agencies. It is absolutely flawless. It will easily pass any initial media and forensic scrutiny. If I hit a single button, this payload goes to every major news network, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI. Your pristine cybersecurity firm will be radioactive by midnight. You will spend the rest of your life rotting in a federal supermax prison." I stared at him, my expression completely blank. I did not move a single muscle. Brandon mistook my silence for fear. He took another step forward, emboldened by his own perceived brilliance, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "All you have to do is tell Donovan to feed that true will into a paper shredder," Brandon ordered, pointing a shaking finger at the lawyer. "Then you give me the decrypted authentication tokens for the Cayman accounts, and you tell the police in the lobby that there has been a terrible misunderstanding. You walk away with your freedom, and I walk away with my money. If you refuse, I destroy your entire existence. And you should know I am not bluffing, Camilla. You know exactly what I am capable of." He leaned over the footboard of my bed, his breath foul and ragged, his eyes gleaming with a sick, twisted joy. "Or did you really think David left you 5 years ago because he could not handle your work schedule?" Brandon whispered, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across his face. The mention of my former fiancé sent a microscopic ripple through my calm facade. David had walked out 3 weeks before our wedding, refusing to give me a concrete reason, packing his bags in the dead of night and cutting off all contact. It had shattered my world, leaving me entirely isolated and burying myself completely in my company to cope with the profound pain and rejection. Brandon saw the recognition flash in my eyes and laughed, a harsh barking sound that made my skin crawl. "That is right, little sister," Brandon gloated. "David did not leave because you worked too much. He left because I sent him a beautifully curated package of photos and text messages, proving you were sleeping with your firm's largest investors. I even included fake bank statements showing you were systematically stealing from his personal accounts. He was so disgusted he could not even bear to look at you. I ruined your happily ever after with a few keystrokes just because I was bored and you were getting too much attention from Dad. Imagine what I can do to you now with unlimited resources and my back against the wall." The silence in the room was absolute. Beatrice covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. Donovan stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek, his grip white-knuckled on his briefcase. I looked at Brandon. I absorbed the full, sickening weight of his sociopathy. He had destroyed my heart, my future, and my trust in other human beings, simply because he viewed my happiness as an inconvenience. He expected me to scream. He expected me to cry, to beg, to negotiate for my life and my company. Instead, I simply lifted my chin and gestured toward the massive 70-inch smart television mounted on the hospital wall directly across from my bed. "Plug it in," I said. Brandon blinked, completely thrown off balance by the cold, icy tone of my voice. "What did you just say?" I said, "Plug it in, Brandon." I repeated, my voice devoid of any human emotion. "The media console is right beneath the television. It has a direct USB port. If your deep fakes are as flawless as you claim, I want to see them on the big screen before I hand over my father's legacy. Plug the drive in. Let us all watch my destruction together." Brandon hesitated. His eyes darted from me to the television to the flash drive in his hand. His arrogance quickly overrode his sudden surge of paranoia. He sneered, turning his back on me and marching over to the wall-mounted media console with heavy, determined steps. "You always were a glutton for punishment, Camilla," he muttered, crouching down and jamming the black flash drive directly into the USB port. "Prepare to watch your entire life burn to the ground." He grabbed the hospital remote from the console and hit the input power button. The massive screen flickered to life, glowing bright blue in the dim room. Brandon crossed his arms, turning back to face me, with a triumphant, malicious grin, waiting for the deep-faked horrors to begin playing. The screen went pitch black for exactly 3 seconds. Then a solid, blindingly bright red background snapped onto the display. There were no deep-faked videos. There were no fabricated bank statements. There were no manipulated audio files. Instead, massive, bold white letters dominated the 70-inch screen, accompanied by the official, unmistakable golden seal of the United States government. Property of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Below the seal, a secondary message flashed in bright yellow text. "Device compromised. All local and cloud-based network files successfully seized. Warrant executed." Brandon stared at the glowing 70-inch screen. The bright red background of the FBI warning bathed his face in a harsh, unforgiving light. The plastic remote control slipped from his slack fingers, clattering against the tile floor. His jaw trembled. He took a step back, shaking his head in a desperate, frantic rhythm, refusing to process the bold yellow letters, declaring his entire digital life had been seized. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a manic, uncomprehending panic, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to form a coherent threat. Before a single word could escape his throat, the heavy wooden doors of the VIP suite swung open. The sharp, synchronized thud of heavy footsteps echoed through the room. Two tall men in dark, immaculately tailored suits strode into the suite. They moved with absolute authority, their posture rigid, and their gazes scanning the room with clinical precision. They bypassed the hospital security guards with a mere nod and came to a stop directly beside Donovan. They flanked the towering attorney, forming an impenetrable wall of legal and federal consequence. The agent on the right reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a gleaming silver badge. He was a man with cold, slate-gray eyes and a sharp jawline that offered absolutely no sympathy. Brandon Wilson, the agent, stated, his voice ringing out with the crisp, undeniable authority of the federal government. I am Special Agent Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation White-Collar Crime Division. This is Special Agent Reynolds. You are hereby ordered to surrender all physical devices, passports, and travel documents immediately. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless squeak from her position on the floor. She scrambled backward, pressing her spine hard against the baseboards, desperately trying to merge with the wallpaper. The grand matriarch of the Wilson family was reduced to a cowering spectator as the absolute destruction of her golden boy unfolded. Brandon's chest heaved. He pointed a shaking, desperate finger at the television screen, his voice cracking under the immense weight of his terror. "You need to arrest her," he screamed, pivoting his frantic energy toward the two agents. "You need to arrest Camilla right now. She hacked my secure devices. She unlawfully breached my private servers and installed malicious malware. That is corporate espionage. That is a direct violation of federal cybersecurity laws. She just confessed to it in this very room. I demand you arrest her." Agent Vance did not even blink. He slowly lowered his badge, slipping it back into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He looked at Brandon with an expression of profound, withering pity. "We are not arresting anyone for corporate espionage today, Mr. Wilson," Agent Vance replied smoothly. "We are, however, executing a federal warrant for grand larceny, wire fraud, extortion, and the embezzlement of federal infrastructure grants. We have been building this exact case for 6 consecutive months. We have monitored your offshore routing numbers, tracked your shell companies, and traced every single dollar you funneled into the Cayman Islands." Brandon swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "But the hack," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between Vance and me. "The illegal breach. She bypassed my encryption. You cannot use that evidence. It is fruit of the poisonous tree. Any first-year law student knows that. She broke the law to get it." Agent Reynolds, the taller of the two men, let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "It is not an illegal breach when the person conducting the digital audit is working under the direct, explicit supervision of the United States Department of Justice." Brandon froze. The air completely evaporated from his lungs. He stared at the agents, then slowly turned his head to look at me. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that offered absolutely zero mercy. "Did you honestly think I spent the last 6 months blindly trusting your financial reports, Brandon?" I asked, my voice echoing with pure vindication. I knew the company numbers were bleeding. I knew the federal grants were vanishing. I also knew that if I simply confronted you, you would destroy the evidence and blame the missing funds on my department. So, I went straight to the authorities. I have been a confidential informant for the FBI since October. Every single keystroke you made, every offshore account you opened, and every piece of dirty money you moved was routed directly through a mirrored server sitting on Agent Vance's desk. You did not just hand me your company, Camilla. Brandon whispered, his voice completely hollow. You handed me a federal trap. You built the trap, Brandon, I corrected him sharply. I just handed them the keys to spring it. And thank you for so loudly and proudly admitting to creating deep-faked blackmail material in front of federal agents. extortion carries a very hefty mandatory minimum sentence. The absolute finality of his situation crashed over Brandon. His shoulders slumped. The arrogant, untouchable CEO was completely gone. He looked at the heavy hospital doors, calculating the impossible odds of a physical escape. He looked at Donovan, who simply shook his head. He looked at Beatrice, who actively turned her face away, refusing to make eye contact with the son she had conspired with. Then Brandon looked at Nia. His wife was still standing perfectly still near the exit, her hands gripping the strap of her designer purse with white-knuckled intensity. Her eyes were wide, filled with the sheer terror of a woman realizing her entire lavish existence was about to be seized by the federal government. Brandon's survival instincts flared one final desperate time. He realized he was drowning and he immediately reached out to drag someone else under the water with him. "Wait!" Brandon shouted, holding his hands up toward the agents in a frantic gesture of surrender. "Wait, I can offer you a deal. I am not the mastermind here. I can give you the entire laundering operation." Agent Vance raised an eyebrow. "We already have the operation, Mr. Wilson." "No, you do not have the architect." Brandon pleaded, his voice rising in panic. He pointed his finger directly at Nia, entirely throwing his wife to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. It was her. Nia orchestrated the entire cleansing process. I just moved the cash, but she is the one who set up the fake real estate portfolios. She used her broker license to generate fraudulent appraisals and wash the money through Platinum Estates. She manipulated the market values. She forced me to keep funneling the cash into her properties because she was drowning in debt. I will testify against her. I will give you every single piece of communication proving she designed the laundering scheme. Just give me a plea deal." Nia's mouth fell open in absolute shock. The pristine, calculating woman snapped. Decades of carefully constructed poise shattered in an instant. The ultimate betrayal by the man she had just tried to sell out pushed her completely over the edge of sanity. "You miserable lying coward," Nia screamed. The sound was raw, tearing through the hospital suite with terrifying volume. She ripped her hand away from the strap of her designer purse and plunged it directly into the main compartment of the bag. The security guards realized what was happening a fraction of a second too late. Nia yanked her hand back out. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room glinted off the polished metal of a loaded compact silver handgun. She raised her arm in one swift, violent motion, aiming the barrel directly at Brandon's chest. The metallic click of the safety disengaging cut through the room louder than a thunderclap. Time seemed to fracture, stretching a single second into an eternity. Federal agents Vance and Reynolds reacted with the terrifying synchronized speed of men who dealt with life or death for a living. In perfect unison, their hands swept inside their tailored jackets. The harsh hospital lights glinted off the dark steel of their service weapons as they leveled their firearms directly at Nia. "Drop the weapon!" Agent Vance roared, his voice stripping away the quiet authority he had held moments before, replacing it with a deafening, lethal command. "Drop it right now." The sudden explosion of violence shattered the frozen tableau. Nurse Jackie did not hesitate or wait for instructions. Her years of emergency room training kicked in instantly. She lunged toward my bed, her strong hands gripping my shoulders. With a forceful yank, she pulled me off the mattress and hauled me down to the cold linoleum floor, dragging me violently behind the heavy steel frame of the medical supply cart. I hit the ground hard, my bandaged hand throbbing, but I kept my eyes fixed on the unfolding nightmare through the gap between the cart's wheels. Nia ignored the federal agents completely. She did not even blink at the two guns pointed at her head. Her hands were shaking violently, the silver barrel of her compact pistol trembling as it remained locked on the center of Brandon's chest. Hot, angry tears carved thick black rivers of mascara down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "You think you can just hand me over to them?" Nia screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged agony. "You think you can use me, destroy my life, and then trade me for a lighter sentence? Put the gun down, Mrs. Wilson." Agent Reynolds ordered slowly, inching forward, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard of his weapon. "Do not make this worse." "Make it worse!" Nia shrieked, letting out a jagged, hysterical laugh. He already made it the worst it could possibly be. "Tell them, Brandon. Tell the feds how I actually got involved in your filthy little laundering scheme." Brandon stood frozen in the center of the room, his hands raised to shoulder height, his eyes wide with stark terror. For the first time in his privileged, sheltered life, he was staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, and his legendary arrogance was rapidly draining away. "Tell them," Nia demanded, stepping closer and jabbing the gun through the air to emphasize her words. "You did not just ask me to wash your stolen federal money. You backed me into a corner and held a knife to my throat. Tell them what you found out about my parents." I watched from the floor, my breath hitching. Nia had always fiercely protected her parents, a quiet, hard-working couple who had emigrated from Eastern Europe decades ago. They were the only soft spot in her otherwise ruthless armor. He dug into their past. Nia continued crying openly, now the gun shaking violently in her grip. He hired private investigators to dig through 30-year-old immigration records. He found a single minor clerical discrepancy in their original visa paperwork, a mistake made by a clerk 3 decades ago, and he brought it to me. He laid the files on our dining room table and told me that if I did not use Platinum Estates to launder his stolen infrastructure grants, he would make one phone call to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He promised me he would have my elderly parents deported back to a country they barely remembered. The silence that followed her confession was suffocating, broken only by the ragged sound of her weeping. Nia had not been a willing accomplice. She had been a hostage to her husband's absolute depravity. "I did everything you asked," she sobbed, glaring at Brandon with pure hatred. "I risked my license, my freedom, and my entire future to protect my family from you. I washed your dirty money. I forged those appraisals. I bought those worthless dirt lots. And now you are standing here selling me out to the federal government to save your own pathetic skin." Agent Vance took another slow, calculated step forward. "Mrs. Wilson, we can protect your parents. We can sort this out with the Department of Justice. But you need to lower the firearm right now. If you pull that trigger, your parents lose their daughter forever." But Brandon could not help himself. The profound, bottomless well of his sociopathy overrode his survival instincts. Even with a loaded gun pointed at his heart, his fragile, massive ego refused to let a woman humiliate him. He let out a sharp, mocking scoff. He lowered his hand slightly, a cruel, condescending smirk twisting his sweaty features. "Oh, please," Brandon sneered, rolling his eyes, as if he were annoyed by a trivial inconvenience rather than a lethal threat. "Stop playing the tragic martyr, Nia. You were not a victim. You enjoyed the money just as much as I did. You loved the designer bags, the luxury cars, and the country club memberships. My little threat about your parents was just the push you needed to justify your own greed. You are a useful idiot with a real estate license, and they were just collateral damage. Do you really think I care about a couple of illegal immigrants? You are weak, Nia. You always were." The absolute cruelty of his words struck the room like a physical blow. He felt zero remorse. He viewed human lives as expendable chess pieces. Nia let out a guttural primal scream. Her finger tightened visibly on the trigger. "No," Beatrice shrieked. The matriarch, who had been cowering silently against the baseboards, suddenly erupted into motion. Unable to watch her golden boy be gunned down, Beatrice decided to play the ultimate hero. She launched herself off the floor with surprising speed, diving directly across the room toward her daughter-in-law. Beatrice hit Nia with her entire body weight just as Nia squeezed the trigger. The gun fired. A deafening, explosive crack violently shattered the air inside the hospital suite. The sound was ear-splitting, ringing in my ears and vibrating through the floorboards. The violent impact of Beatrice's tackle jerked Nia's arm wildly upward. The bullet missed Brandon's chest by mere inches, slicing through the air and slamming directly into the massive reinforced glass window of the VIP suite. The thick glass exploded outward in a spectacular shower of crystalline shards, raining thousands of jagged pieces down onto the pavement below. The sudden drop in air pressure and the howling wind from outside rushed into the room, creating a vortex of absolute chaos. Gun Agent Vance roared. Vance and Reynolds moved with lethal, unhesitating force. They holstered their weapons in a fraction of a second and tackled both screaming women directly to the linoleum floor. The pile of tangled limbs, expensive silk, and designer bags slammed onto the tile. Reynolds pinned Beatrice by her shoulders while Vance grabbed Nia's wrist, slamming it hard against the floor until her fingers opened and the silver handgun skittered away, sliding under the hospital bed. Nurse Jackie kept her body pressed firmly over mine, shielding me from the flying debris and the violent scuffle playing out just a few feet away. I peered around the edge of the medical cart, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The agents were completely occupied shouting commands and wrestling handcuffs onto the thrashing, hysterical women. Brandon stood in the center of the room, completely untouched by the bullet, but entirely aware that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. He looked at his mother being shoved face first into the floor by a federal agent. He looked at his wife sobbing hysterically as steel cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. Then Brandon locked eyes with me. For one brief fleeting moment, the mask slipped. I saw the absolute terror, the profound realization that his entire empire of lies had burned to ash, leaving him with absolutely nothing. He had no money, no leverage, and no family left to manipulate. Brandon broke our gaze. He spun on his heel, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the tile. Using the chaotic, violent distraction of his mother and wife being arrested on the floor, Brandon lunged for the heavy wooden door of the suite, ripping it open and bolting blindly into the hospital corridor. Brandon burst through the heavy oak doors of the VIP suite, not daring to look back at the shattered glass, his screaming wife, or his mother bleeding on the floor. The sterile white hospital corridor stretched before him like a runway to absolute salvation. His lungs burned and his heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. He pushed his legs to move faster, his expensive leather loafers slipping slightly on the highly polished linoleum. He actually thought he had made it. He thought his mother's idiotic, impulsive interference had handed him the ultimate golden ticket. His mind raced rapidly, calculating his escape route. He just needed to reach the emergency stairwell at the end of the hall, bypass the main lobby, and disappear into the underground parking garage. He had offshore accounts that the feds did not know about yet. He had untraceable bearer bonds hidden in a safety deposit box in Zurich. He just needed a burner phone and a flight out of the country. He felt a surge of manic, unhinged triumph. He was Brandon Wilson. He was untouchable. He always won. He rounded the corner toward the elevators at a full, reckless sprint. He did not even see the solid wall of navy blue windbreakers until it was far too late. Bright yellow letters spelling out FBI blocked the entire width of the hallway. Brandon let out a panicked gasp and tried to pivot his expensive shoes, skidding wildly as he desperately attempted to change direction. A massive hospital security guard, a man built like a brick wall, stepped squarely into his path. A federal agent flanking the guard simply raised a thick, muscular arm. The clothesline impact was brutal and uncompromising. The agent's forearm caught Brandon directly across the throat and collarbone. The sheer kinetic force of his own sprinting momentum lifted his feet entirely off the ground. Brandon hung suspended in the air for a fraction of a second before slamming backward onto the hard linoleum with a bone-rattling thud. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs in a violent, wheezing rush. White-hot stars burst across his vision. Before he could even attempt to suck in a desperate gasp of air, heavy, unforgiving knees pressed brutally into his spine. Rough, highly trained hands grabbed his wrists, wrenching them painfully behind his back. The cold, sharp bite of steel handcuffs clicked shut over his skin, locking him permanently into his new reality. "Get him up," a voice barked. Two federal agents hauled Brandon upright by his armpits, dragging his limp, gasping body back down the corridor. His legs felt like jelly, his highly polished shoes dragging uselessly against the floor. The humiliation was absolute. He was paraded past staring nurses, shocked doctors, and frightened patients. They shoved him roughly back through the ruined doorway of the VIP suite. The room was still a chaotic war zone of broken glass and hyperventilating family members. Agent Reynolds had Nia secured in a corner, her wrists bound in steel as she wept uncontrollably. Another agent was standing over a sobbing Beatrice who was clutching a cut on her cheek. The agents dumped Brandon unceremoniously into a vinyl visitor chair in the center of the room. He slumped forward, defeated, gasping for air. His perfectly tailored designer suit was torn, his expensive silk tie askew, and his arrogant facade completely pulverized. I placed my uninjured hand on the edge of the metal medical cart and slowly pushed myself up to a standing position. Nurse Jackie stayed close by my side, her eyes darting around the secured room, but the immediate lethal threat had been entirely neutralized. I stepped out from the protective cover of the cart, my bare feet crunching faintly against the stray shards of glass scattered across the tile. I walked directly over to Brandon, looking down at the pathetic broken man slouched in the chair. He slowly lifted his head. The arrogant, untouchable CEO was completely gone. In his place was the hollow, vacant stare of a man who finally realized he had lost absolutely everything. I stared at him, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure washing away years of residual pain and engineered isolation. "Do you remember the night you officially took over the company, Brandon?" I asked, my voice cutting cleanly through the heavy, sniffling silence of the room. It was pouring rain. "You changed the locks on the family estate while I was attending Dad's funeral. When I showed up at the front gate, you instructed the private security guards to refuse my entry. You told them to toss a single black garbage bag over the wrought iron fence. It landed right in the mud." Brandon squeezed his eyes shut, actively turning his face away, completely unable to look at me. "You stood on the second-floor balcony, holding a glass of expensive scotch." I continued, my tone sharp, cold, and entirely uncompromising. "You looked down at me standing in the freezing rain and laughed. You said I was an ungrateful parasite who would never amount to anything without the family name backing me up. You told me I was entirely worthless. You threw me out into the street with nothing but a trash bag of damp clothes and a suspended bank account. You thought you buried me that night." I leaned in slightly, ensuring he heard every single word. "You never realized you were just stripping away the toxic family name that was holding me back. I built $1 billion cybersecurity empire starting with that single trash bag of clothes. And now I am going to stand right here and watch the federal government strip away every single thing you stole." Agent Vance stepped forward, interrupting the tense, heavy silence. He grabbed Brandon by the shoulder, hauling him up slightly against the back of the chair to conduct a thorough physical search of his pockets. Vance's hands moved with practiced clinical efficiency, patting down the ruined suit jacket and trousers. He reached deep into the inner lining of Brandon's breast pocket and pulled out a small cylindrical object. Vance held it up to the harsh hospital light. It was a tiny, completely unlabeled glass vial filled with a clear, viscous liquid. A short, sterile hypodermic syringe was taped securely to the side of the glass. Brandon's face instantly drained of all remaining color. He went completely ashen, looking as though he might violently vomit right there on the floor. His breathing hitched, his eyes locking onto the small glass vial with absolute terror. Agent Vance turned away from the trembling, ruined CEO. He looked directly across the room, locking eyes with the woman standing right beside me. "Is this it?" Agent Vance asked, his voice deadly serious and echoing with grave legal implications. "Is this what you saw him trying to inject into her IV line before the lawyers arrived, Nurse Jackie?" The absolute silence that followed Agent Vance's question was heavier than concrete. Everyone in the VIP suite stopped breathing. The air conditioning hummed softly, a stark contrast to the lethal reality suddenly dominating the room. Brandon sat rigid in his vinyl visitor chair. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He stared at the small glass vial suspended between the federal agent's fingers, as if it were a live grenade. Nurse Jackie stepped out from behind the medical cart. She smoothed down her scrubs, her posture radiating absolute professional fury. She looked directly at Agent Vance and nodded, her voice steady and echoing with undeniable authority. "That is exactly the vial I saw him holding," Jackie stated, pointing a firm finger directly at Brandon. "When I walked into the suite to check on Camilla's vitals, he was standing over her bed. He had the port of her IV line pinched between his fingers. He had already pierced the membrane with that syringe. He was about to depress the plunger when the hinges of the door squeaked. It startled him. He panicked, ripped the entire IV line out of her arm to cover up the puncture mark, and threw the vial into his breast pocket. He tried to play it off as a violent outburst of anger. He told me he just wanted his sister to wake up and sign some family paperwork. A sickening wave of realization washed over me. I looked at the dark purple bruising already forming on my forearm where the plastic tubing had been violently torn from my vein. The puzzle pieces snapped into a horrifying crystal-clear picture. He was not just trying to force a signature, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, razor-sharp whisper. Brandon flinched at the sound of my voice. He violently shook his head, his handcuffed wrists rattling loudly against the back of the plastic chair. "That is a lie," he stammered, his words stumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "She is lying. That is just a B12 supplement. I was trying to help you. You were so weak. I was just trying to give you a boost of energy so you could focus on the legal documents." "You are a terrible liar, Brandon," I interrupted, stepping closer until I towered over his seated, pathetic form. "You knew I would never sign over my voting rights or my shares of the firm. You knew that even if you forced my hand or forged my signature, I would immediately challenge it in court the second I was discharged. You needed a permanent solution." I turned my gaze to Agent Vance, who was carefully sliding the deadly vial into a clear plastic evidence bag. If I had to guess, I continued, keeping my eyes locked on the terrified CEO, that vial contains a concentrated dose of potassium chloride. It is completely untraceable in a standard autopsy. It mimics a massive, sudden myocardial infarction. You plan to inject me, watch my heart stop on the monitors, and then scream for the nurses. You would play the devastated, grieving brother. Then you would pull out the forged will claiming we had just finalized our family succession plans, moments before my tragic, unexpected medical complication. Agent Reynolds let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disgust. "It is textbook," Reynolds noted, pulling out a small notepad. "We see it all the time in these high-net-worth inheritance cases. A sudden heart attack, a conveniently updated will, and a single family member present in the room when the monitors flatline. We will have the lab run a full toxicology screen on the liquid, but I guarantee you are exactly right, Camilla. This was an attempted homicide." "No!" Brandon shrieked, thrashing wildly in the chair. "You have no proof. You cannot prove intent. You cannot prove what is in that vial until you test it. You are all framing me." The sound of a sharp, hyperventilating gasp drew everyone's attention to the far wall. Beatrice was sitting on the floor, her hands cuffed securely behind her back. Her expensive silk blouse was torn from the scuffle, and her perfectly styled hair hung in ragged clumps around her face. She was staring at her golden boy with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The matriarch of the Wilson family had spent her entire life defending Brandon. She had covered up his embezzlements, paid off his mistresses, and actively participated in stealing my inheritance just to ensure her precious son remained at the top of the social hierarchy. She had turned a blind eye to his cruelty and his corruption because she believed he was simply ambitious. But murder, the cold-blooded murder of her own daughter, that was a line she had never even considered crossing. "Brandon." Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "Tell me they are lying. Tell me you were not actually going to kill your sister." Brandon glared at his mother, his upper lip curling into a vicious sneer. "Oh, shut up, Mom. Stop acting like your hands are clean. You helped me forge the estate documents. You helped me bribe the notary. We are in this together." "I was not going to murder her!" Beatrice screamed, struggling against her handcuffs to push herself upward against the wall. "I wanted the money. I wanted control of the firm. I did not want her dead." Beatrice looked wildly around the room, her panicked eyes landing on the federal agents. The sheer magnitude of the situation completely broke her carefully constructed socialite facade. The desire to save herself from a murder charge completely obliterated her maternal loyalty. "He promised me no one would get hurt," Beatrice cried out, her chest heaving as she openly sobbed. "He told me he had a plan. He said he acquired a heavy medical-grade sedative on the black market. He told me he was just going to inject Camilla's IV line to make her highly compliant and confused. He promised me he would just make her groggy enough to put her thumbprint and signature on the digital transfer tokens." Beatrice locked her terrified, streaming eyes onto Agent Vance, pleading with him to believe her innocence. "You told me it was just a sedative so she would sign the papers," she wailed, turning her horrified gaze back to Brandon. "You lied to me. You were going to kill her right in front of me." Agent Vance slowly zipped the plastic evidence bag shut. He slipped the deadly vial securely into his jacket pocket and looked down at the hysterical matriarch bleeding on the hospital floor. A slow, chilling smirk spread across his sharp features. "Congratulations, ma'am," Agent Vance said, his voice dripping with pure, unapologetic satisfaction. "You just confessed to conspiracy to commit murder." The words "conspiracy to commit murder" echoed off the sterile walls of the VIP suite, hanging in the air, with the heavy, undeniable weight of a finalized prison sentence. Beatrice stopped thrashing against the federal agent holding her shoulder. Her legs simply gave out. The aristocratic matriarch of the Wilson family, a woman who had spent decades cultivating an image of absolute untouchable perfection, dropped heavily onto the linoleum. Her knees hit the hard floor with a dull, sickening thud. Because her hands were secured firmly behind her back in steel handcuffs, she could not catch herself or break her fall. She swayed awkwardly, her designer silk skirt soaking up the spilled medical fluids and sweeping over the scattered, glittering fragments of broken glass. She did not care. The absolute terror of spending the rest of her life in a federal penitentiary completely overrode her vanity. Beatrice shifted her weight and began to crawl. It was a pathetic, disjointed, desperate shuffle. She dragged herself across the tile, inching closer and closer to where I stood beside the metallic medical cart. "Camila." Beatrice sobbed, the sound tearing violently from her throat and echoing through the ruined room. "Camila, please. You have to tell them. Tell them I would never agree to a murder. I only wanted the money. I only wanted the firm. I did not want you dead. You have to believe me." I looked down at the woman who had brought me into the world. Her expensive, meticulously applied makeup was smeared in dark, wet streaks across her cheeks. A small cut on her forehead, courtesy of her desperate tackle earlier, was bleeding freely, the red drops staining the collar of her ruined blouse. She looked nothing like the powerful woman who had ruled the family estate with an iron fist. She looked like a cornered, terrified animal. "Please, my daughter," Beatrice begged, craning her neck upward to meet my gaze. Her voice was hysterical, frantic, stripping away any remaining shred of her dignity. "I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I carried you for 9 months. You cannot let them take me away in handcuffs. You owe me your life. Tell them to let me go." I stared down at her. I waited for a familiar pang of guilt or a rush of residual familial warmth. I waited to feel the lifelong conditioning that had always forced me to placate her, to fold under her demands, and to beg for her approval. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sorrow. The deep well of forgiveness I had always reserved for my family had run entirely dry. I squared my shoulders, my posture rigid, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that immediately commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "You gave birth to me, Beatrice," I stated, enunciating each syllable with surgical, uncompromising precision. "That is a biological fact. It is not a motherly achievement. You do not get to cash in maternal chips that you never actually earned." "But I am your family," she wailed, twisting her shoulders against the steel cuffs binding her wrists, her jewelry clinking sharply against the metal. "I loved you in my own way. We are blood. Blood means nothing to you unless it is spilled to protect Brandon," I shot back, taking a slow step forward so she had to strain her neck even further to look up at me. "Do you remember the winter I was 16 years old, Beatrice? Do you remember the week before Brandon graduated from his exclusive private high school?" Beatrice blinked rapidly, her tears momentarily pausing as deep confusion washed over her panicked features. "What are you talking about?" she gasped, shaking her head. "I was hospitalized." I continued, my voice, steady, unyielding, and ringing with decades of suppressed anger. "I had double pneumonia. I was lying in a hospital bed very similar to this one, struggling to pull oxygen into my lungs. My fever was dangerously high. The hospital billing department called the house because my health insurance had mysteriously lapsed. They needed a credit card to cover a $3,000 deductible for my breathing treatments and my extended stay. I watched the memory register in her eyes. I watched the guilt briefly flash across her face before she instinctively tried to bury it. "You answered the phone," I said, refusing to let her look away. "You told the hospital financial administrator that I was a rebellious teenager. You told them I was an emancipated minor and that the Wilson family was no longer financially responsible for my medical care. You refused to pay the $3,000 to help your own daughter breathe. I was trying to teach you independence." Beatrice stammered, weakly offering the exact same pathetic excuse she had used for decades to justify her neglect. "Money was tight that month. We were cash poor." "You were not cash poor," I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. "The very next morning you drove to the luxury jeweler downtown. You dropped $35,000 in cash on a solid gold Rolex Daytona. You bought it as a graduation present for Brandon because he needed to look the part of a future CEO. You let me lay in a hospital bed choking on fluid because your golden boy required a shiny new toy for his wrist." Brandon sat silently in his vinyl visitor chair just a few feet away. He did not defend his mother. He did not offer a single word of support or comfort. He simply stared at the floor, completely consumed by his own impending ruin. He was perfectly content to let his mother take the fall if it meant buying himself another second of breathing room. I looked from Brandon's cowardly slumped form back down to Beatrice. She was shivering now, the cold reality of her situation finally setting in. She looked at her son, waiting for him to intervene, waiting for him to use his brilliant legal mind to save her. Brandon refused to even meet her eyes. The federal agents stood quietly by the door, allowing the confrontation to unfold, their hands resting loosely on their utility belts. They knew a confession when they heard one, and Beatrice was digging her own grave with every word she spoke. "I was protecting the family image," Beatrice cried, her voice dropping to a hoarse, defeated whisper. "Brandon was the heir. He was the future. You were always so difficult. And now the heir is going to federal prison for attempted murder," I said, my tone completely flat and devoid of emotion. "And you are going right alongside him as an accessory." Beatrice let out a long, agonizing wail. She dropped her forehead against the cold linoleum, weeping with the profound, devastating realization that she had sacrificed her entire life, her morals, and her daughter for a son who was currently letting her take the blame. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I looked at the broken woman sobbing at my feet. A calculated strategy formed instantly in my mind. I did not just want them in prison. I wanted the estate completely recovered. I wanted every single asset they had stolen from my father legally returned to my control. I slowly crouched down, ignoring the sharp twinge of pain in my bruised arm where the IV had been ripped away. I lowered myself until I was directly eye level with my mother. She lifted her tear-streaked face.
lên không được. Quá quăng vô rồi 4 phút chịu rồi. Biết có đa bao nhiêu phút rồi. Còn được em luôn.
Có gì không có đi. Đi cắt câu đi.
Dạ chịu lúc rồi.
Cắt nhỏ ra. Câu.
Câu. Má, ngàn mấy câu á cha. 1.200 câu á. Câu làm được câu chứ. Chuyển tiếp luôn á. Thầy lên các câu đó.
Đừng có biết chưa? Để con chỉ về con này nè, để đầu tiên lũng lẳng trên cái bóng.
Cuối là